Thank you very much, Shally, for the very nice introduction. First of all, thank you, Schelling, Henning, Johannes, as well as all your colleagues and helpers for making this virtual conference possible. It was a lot of work, and I really saw it in the preparation. It was a lot of work, and you did it excellently. So thank you very much for all your efforts to set up this amazing conference. So, to my presidential address, a research project is embedded into a multitude of factors and evolves through several phases. In the following, I would like to illustrate the evolution of a particular research project, that is, a research project that my colleagues and I have conducted at the universities of Zurich and Bern in Switzerland as an example. This example also shows how international collaboration via SPR fosters empirical psychotherapy research. For reasons I will explain in a minute, I chose agricultural metaphors. So to start with, I chose the soil as a metaphor. That is, in this case, the state of psychotherapy research. Then collecting and planting seeds. In my case, that's my biographical and conceptual influences impacting upon the research project. Then the flourishing and harvesting part, that is the study that I'm going to present and its results. It's a study we've conducted in Zurich at the University of Zurich with exposure-based cognitive therapy, which I'm going to elaborate on later on. Then you process your crops, and the processing of these crops was doing many secondary analyses. Then you use your products, and I attempt to give some potential therapist recommendations and will refrain from using the conjunctive for a change. But of course, everything has to be tested again. And to end with and start a new circle is do a new planning for future research project. And as you will see, psychotherapy research, not only in this case, is to a very large degree about significant people who lend their shoulders to stand on whatever you do or whenever you do research. So, as everybody knows, psychotherapy research went through several phases. My doctoral supervisor, Klaus Grabe auf Deutsch, on German, outlined several phases in his presidential address in the mid-1990s. It all began with psychotherapy having to justify its overall effectiveness, called the legitimation phase. Then researchers asked themselves which form of psychotherapy is better or even best, called this competition phase. After that, they asked themselves which form of psychotherapy is indicated for whom and when. This is called the prescription phase. And then a phase started called the process research phase, in which to ask in which way does psychotherapy work. Of course, process research was always present. If we look at Carl Rogers, that's probably where it all began. But from that time on, it became predominant. So, of course, the online of phases of psychotherapy research so far was formulated over 20 years ago. And if we look at the title of this year's conference, we feel justified to also add a fifth phase we may call the personalization phase. As for example, Wolfgang Lutz stresses psychotherapy has always been personalized, and his leading question reminds of Paul Henry's famous question, but now the personalization should be based on empirical findings. When searching for the personal seeds of this particular research project, I need to go way back historically to talk about the likely origins of my personal motivation and the influences leading to conducting a particular research. But please don't worry, I will not talk about myself for the rest of my time. But let's start with a quiz. What has a grocery store in a small village in Germany to do with the fall of the wall in Berlin and SPR? Well, nothing directly, but indirectly, it serves explaining the biographical and motivational background of my research. What do I mean by that? My grandparents had a small grocery store, a picture of which you see on top, in a small village in the middle of post-war Germany, let's say 300 miles away from Heidelberg. And as a child, my mother had to help in the family business. The only way for her to get suspended from these obligations was to claim having to work for school. So from that time on, education figured as something very helpful in my mother and later on in our family, including me. Later on, my mother became a teacher and met my father, who, when I grew up, in another small German village, worked as a salesman of agricultural machines. There come the agricultural metaphors. The picture of me sitting on a tractor, you see maybe that I had red hair when I was young, also signifies another motivation probably stemming from my deceased father, that is to go out and experience new and exciting things. This picture of me, or this motivation, probably was a major factor of me choosing to move to faraway Berlin for my undergraduate. Then societal factors heavily influenced my academic direction. That is, the fall of the wall half a year later. Despite of this being very exciting, this had also the consequence of Berlin, the city of Berlin and the state of Berlin having no money for paying university staff and research, so that I searched for a doctoral supervisor outside of Berlin. Because Klaus Grabe had just published a big meta-analysis on the efficacy of psychotherapy and had also published on psychotherapy process research, I decided to move to the University of Bern in Switzerland to do my PhD in clinical psychology. Having finished this with a thesis on the assessment of motivational factors in psychotherapy, I searched for a postdoc supervisor in the field of psychotherapy research with a strong emphasis on psychotherapy integration. So through the SPR context of Klaus Grabe, I made one of the best decisions of my life, that is to do my postdoc with Louis Castonguay at Penn State University. Klaus Grabe, one of the founding fathers of SPR, personified psychotherapy integration to a large extent. For him, integration was the integration of empirical findings on psychotherapy process and outcome, the integration of basic and applied sciences, integration of process and practice, and the integration of all findings and thinking into an overarching theory, in this case, or in his case, called consistency theory. In his presidential address in the mid-1990s, he also coined the term of second-generation therapies. Second-generation therapies followed, of course, after the first-generation therapies. First-generation therapies being the traditional approaches. And here's a picture of Klaus Grabe being the priest at the funeral of psychotherapy approaches. And he suggested second-generation therapies to develop post-hoc theories based on the empirical findings. So these second-generation therapies should marry the achievements of the first-generation therapies but continuously strive to incorporate new empirical findings. Rather than reacting directly to a patient property, such as diagnosis or interpersonal style, the therapist's decisions should follow principles and may be determined by therapeutic change factors. He called them Wirkfaktoren in Germany, or in German. And he suggested within a session, the following change factors are active, and he generated these change factors theoretically. At first, of course, the therapist should establish a good working alliance. Then, two kind of preconditions for effective therapy sessions should be present. That is, the therapist should activate the patient's resources, so everything the patient has or wants or can use. And of course, as everybody knows, if you want to change a problem, you've got to metaphorically put it on the table. So to actuate or activate the problem, and these three factors could be considered the necessary ground for change within a session. And then he suggested, let's say, two active Wirkfaktoren, change factors. That is motivational clarification. That is largely what originally psychodynamic, psychoanalytic therapies have done. And problem mastery, that was at that time what traditionally behavior therapy had done. These, let's say, active change factors were assumed to lead to corrective experiences, and these corrective experiences then contributed to beneficial change for the patient. He called his second generation therapy psychological therapy. As mentioned, in my dissertation, I empirically developed a taxonomy as well as questionnaires to assess the intensity and satisfaction of patients' clinically relevant approach and avoidance motives on the basis of individual case formulations, which have been formulated based on Franz Kasper's plan analysis. While the approach motives assess what a person finds important in life, the avoidance motives represent what the patient fears and tries to avoid in life. Here are a couple of examples of the scales. In the following studies, we particularly focused on the role of avoidance motives. As I will report in a minute, as you will see, the motive of avoiding vulnerability turned out to be particularly important. As mentioned before, the decision to do my postdoc with Louis resulted in a very enriching experience as well as a productive time, yielding empirical as well as conceptual publications in roughly 3 fields. That is psychotherapy integration, process research with a focus on depression treatment, as well as motivational, interpersonal factors. And as you will see, these components all influence the research program I will report about later. And in working on one of the conceptual publications, I was also introduced to a systematization of change processes in psychotherapy that I found very useful to sort constructs in psychotherapy process and outcome research. This systematization is the so-called 4-step model of change in psychotherapy by Brian Dawes. While it was not recognized much right after its publication, the model became better known by Paul Christoph and colleagues' chapter on process outcome research in the 2013 Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change. In his model, he conceptualized first change processes. These are the on the one hand, the therapy change processes, which are the interventions therapists apply during the sessions. Then the in-session processes directly influence patients' behaviors and experiences, called client change processes. And these in-session processes generate, hopefully, changes in patient characteristics and experiences, in patient characteristics of fields called the change mechanisms. And these change mechanisms hopefully feed into the therapy outcome. In this framework, Gravi's change factors mentioned before would be classified as client change processes. So in the following, I will illustrate the use of DOS model for describing studies on a change factor-based psychotherapy in burn, before I'll proceed with describing a larger RCT at the University of Zurich. Using his change factors as a conceptual framework, Klaus Gravi conducted an RCT hypothesizing that an integrative therapy that uses all change factors and related interventions would outperform a therapy that uses all but the interventions, facilitating motivational clarification. The formerly mentioned therapy looked very much like a standard CBT. The intensity of avoidance motives or motivations served as proxy of motivational conflicts to be targeted in the integrated condition, but not in the CBT condition. So very sadly, Klaus Gravi died before the study was finished, so that I had the obligation and honor to publish the results of his RCT comparing psychological therapy versus standard CBT. To make a very long story short, the trial with 67 patients of different diagnoses yielded equal symptomatic outcomes. But, however, in the integrated condition, patients with higher levels of avoidance motives showed a better improvement of interpersonal problems in the integrated condition. Next, we were interested in whether the reduction of avoidance motivation could be considered a change mechanism in integrative psychotherapy. Indeed, in a naturalistic sample of 61 outpatients of the burn clinic, the reduction of avoidance motivation predicted symptom reduction post-treatment. In a more detailed exploratory analysis, reducing the fear vulnerability at the scale level, and particularly reducing the fear of showing one's weaknesses at an item level, which you see in the picture here, was predictive of outcome. Next, we wanted to know which in-session experiences, that is, client change processes in DOS terms, could be responsible for the reduction of avoidance motivation. In the same sample as in the previous analyses, patients had also reported on client change processes using the Burns post-session report. And as hypothesized, early clarification experiences and later mastery experiences predicted the reduction of avoidance motives. With all this conceptual and empirical material in my backpack, I moved on and applied for a big grant from the Swiss National Science Foundation, SNSF, for an RCT on another change factor-based psychotherapy, that is so-called exposure-based cognitive therapy in comparison to a standard CBT. EBCT fosters explicitly emotional processing within a CBT framework. It is important to note that for us, EBCT was not seen as a new therapy brand to be promoted, but as an experimental condition that was developed according to principles of assimilative integration to test out various process outcome hypotheses. EBCT was originally developed by Cadell Hayes, a fellow graduate student of Louis Castonguay, supervised by Marvin Goldfried. And in EBCT, in the working phase, patients systematically approach avoided emotions, that is the exposure part, explore depressive patterns, that is the processing part, and try to disrupt these patterns. In an open trial, depressed patients showed substantial reductions of depressive symptoms, as well as stronger processing in the working phase that was predictive of outcome. In the original EBCT, interventions used in the working phase were not explicitly emotion focused. So in the Zurich trial, we adopted the general structure of EBCT, but more explicitly operationalized the fostering of emotional processing by EFT interventions, such as 1 or 2 chair exercises. And in another pilot trial in Switzerland of 20 sessions, the 21 depressed patients also reported substantial symptoms reductions post-therapy, as well as emotional arousal and processing in the working phase that again predicted outcome. So we were encouraged by the results of the pilot trials and conducted a larger RCT comparing manualized EBCT or CBT over 22 sessions within the same therapist design. That means all therapists worked in both conditions to weaken the therapist effects. That was a pretty particular decision to train therapists in both conditions. But since they were pretty young therapists, not so far in their postgraduate education, this was possible. So, as many other depression trials, I first have to introduce my graduate students here on the left, Nadja Dörig, then David Altenstein, and then Tobias Krieger, who probably also listens to this talk. So, as in many other depression trials, we observed equal reductions of depressive symptoms with large effect in both conditions, but no differential pattern of symptom change. Well, this was very disappointing given the amount of money we put in that, or actually the Swiss population put in that, via the Swiss National Science Foundation. And we had to conclude that this integration of emotion-focused techniques within an exposure framework did not have added benefit in terms of symptom reduction. But fortunately, life went on, and we started doing secondary analyses with the EBCT dataset, largely with the help of my postdoc from Buenos Aires, whom you see here, that is Juan Martin Gomez Penedo. And actually this picture was taken at the last Presence conference in Buenos Aires. So, like our colleagues from the University of Massachusetts, and like others, we assumed that while outcomes were equal, there might be different processes and mechanisms of change which we then set out to explore further. Before reporting on the secondary analyses, I would like to give you an overview of the relevant variables as representatives of the 4 steps of change according to Brian Dawes. So, therapy change processes were represented by the interventions within the 2 different interventions in the 2 different conditions, that is CBT interventions and specific EFT interventions, emotion-focused interventions. Then client change processes, in that case, were cognitive restructuring and emotional processing. The change mechanisms we looked at, you can read here. I'm not going to read them all down to you. I'm going to go into more detail in the following. And of course, the therapy outcome always was the change of depressive symptoms. In addition, we also looked at moderators. In this case, I will report on interpersonal problems as a moderator of outcomes. In the first two secondary analyses, we looked at the prediction of longer-term outcome by variables assessed post-treatment, representing potential change targets. In that case, self-compassion and discrepant self-view, which I'm going to elaborate on later. The third secondary analysis examine the prediction of post-therapy outcome by the change of one specific variable, that is negative mood regulation expectancies. So not negative mood regulation, but expectancies to be able to regulate your negative moods. In the fourth and the central analysis, we attempted to test the whole model of change by Brian Doss, testing different hypothesized serial mediational pathways. And when I talk about we, I talk to a large extent of Juan Martin Gomez-Pinedo, but also Tobias Krieger and others. And in the last two secondary analyses, we focused on different moderators of post-session outcomes. So let's briefly look at the studies in more detail. In the first secondary analysis, we tested whether a lack of self-compassion may be a cause or a consequence of depression or both. We assessed self-reported and diagnosed depression as well as self-reported self-compassion after therapy, so when the therapy was over, as well as at 6 months and 12 months after therapy. Analyzing this data, we found that a lack of self-compassion predicted subsequent depression, but not vice versa. Thus, thus a lack of self-compassion could be a vulnerability factor for depression, so that an increase of self-compassion in treatment might be a target for psychotherapy. In the second secondary analysis on the prediction of longer-term outcome, we assumed that biased self-related processing, that is, a negative distortion of self-related information, can be a risk factor for relapse after successful psychotherapy. So here, in this case, biased self-related processing was operationalized as a discrepancy between implicit and explicit negative self-depressed associations. So the implicit negative self-association was assessed by implicit association tests. That's a reaction time test. The explicit negative self-associations were assessed via identical self-report items. So what was asked in the implicit test was asked more or less to the same formulations, but this time within a questionnaire, not under time pressure within the IAT. A damaged self-esteem pattern, as you've seen here, means that you have a stronger explicit than implicit negative self-association. You could say that you find yourself negative more consciously than you do at heart. So interestingly, patients with such a damaged self-esteem pattern after treatment had a worse long-term prognosis. So considering yourself negative more consciously than at heart seems to put patients at risk for getting more depressed after therapy. Directly targeting the damaged self-esteem pattern may also help preventing depressive relapses. In a third secondary analysis, we analyzed whether the improvement of expectancies to regulate your negative emotions predicts treatment outcome, and whether the improvement of these so-called NMRE is equally important in CBT and the integrative EBCT. So depression and NMRE were assessed at intake, session 7 and 14, as well as post. And using multi-level modeling, we found that the change of NMRE predicted depression outcome, and patients in CBT benefited more from improvements in NMRE than patients in EBCT. So the change of NMRE, negative mood regulation expectancies, may be a relevant change mechanism in the psychotherapy for depression, and particularly so in therapies that do not include components directly targeting emotions. Mindful of possibly different routes leading to Rome or Heidelberg, we examined a theory-relevant mechanism for each treatment condition. Few studies have tested all 4 steps according to Brian Dawes simultaneously, and none had done so with regard to long-term outcomes. In our analyses, or results of our analyses showed that EBCT fostered greater during treatment increases in emotional processing. It fostered a higher self-efficacy during follow-up than CBT, and both of the above were associated with a better long-term depression outcome. Unexpectedly, however, the change of cognitive restructuring did not differ between EBCT and CBT, and across both CBT and EBCT, greater during treatment increases in cognitive restructuring related to a greater self-efficacy across follow-up, which then in turn was associated with lower long-term depression. So we concluded that therapists might improve long-term depression outcomes by fostering both emotional processing as well as cognitive restructuring, which operate either directly or indirectly by different mechanisms. Oops. In the penultimate secondary analysis I report here, we looked at the role of changes in the alliance for outcome, and we wanted to know whether there are specific patient groups for whom an improved alliance might be particularly beneficial. So we assessed interpersonal problems at intake, as well as alliance and depression session by session. So every session alliance and depression level was assessed. Computing multi-level models again, we could show that session by session alliance changes predicted session-wise depression changes, and submissive patients benefited more from improvements in the therapeutic alliance. And it can always get more complex, as everybody knows. And because the last analysis was really complex and we have proceeded quite much in the talk, I suggest you to read the respective publication, and that's a way of preventing cognitive overload. So please read the publication. I want to come to potential therapist recommendations. And as it's indicated here, they all have to be tested further. And as I indicated before, I refrained from using could or should or any conjunctive to formulate these potential therapist recommendations easily. But of course, that's not the truth. That's not the final wisdom. This is just to make clear what could be recommendations. So, from the first analysis, avoidant depressive patients profit more from integrated therapy than from CBT, to be tested, of course. Then, cultivating self-compassion within the therapy helps to prevent future depression. Depressive patients with discrepant self-views need continuation-phase treatment. In developing confidence to regulate negative emotions is more important for depressive patients in CBT than in EBCT. Both fostering emotional processing via EFT interventions and cognitive restructuring via CBT interventions helps depressed patients to get sustainably better. Ultimately, fostering the alliance in depression therapy enhances session outcome, particularly for submissive patients. And finally, and you see here, it was rather complicated, this analysis, submissive depressive patients benefit more from the therapist responding dominantly to their submissive behaviors, while overly dominant patients benefited more from the therapist responding dominantly to dominant behaviors. So, as I said, everything has to be tested, and these are nice hypotheses to be used for future research. So what I've presented so far are different parts of a big puzzle, which is far from being completed, of course. Since early attempts for systematic personalization based on aptitude treatment interactions, for example, by Larry Bugler and colleagues, we've come a long way. But still, we have several challenges ahead, a few of which are listed below, together with sample new publications. So first, we need to systematize change processes, change mechanisms, change and predictors of these changes, as well as criteria for selecting the change processes, change mechanisms, and predictors for your particular research. With the continuous progress of information technology, we will be able to test more and more complex models instead of single process outcome relations. And based on empirical research, we will be better and better able to systematically match change processes, change mechanisms, interventions, and therapies to single patients based on, for example, participant characteristics, early therapy processes, or early outcomes. So to make a personalized differential process indication. So in the process of therapy, to make a differential indication for different proceeding, different interventions, not for whole packages, but for at a lower level, single interventions. And finally, we need to develop and test the systematic implementation of research-based decision heuristics into clinical practice. That is, for example, via automized feedbacks, using, for example, the TRIA treatment navigator introduced by Wolfgang Lutz and colleagues. And that all should, of course, result in better and better research-based therapist recommendations, fostering better and better outcomes. by describing an example of growing a psychotherapy research project in that phase our own, I was able to show to also, or hope I was able to show that scientific progress is to a large extent also about people. People, that is from and for our therapists, from and for our patients, of course, from and for researchers, and all that within our beautiful society. I thank all the people I've mentioned in this talk, all the people who were relevant to what I presented, and you all for lending me your ears and eyes. And I wish you all an inspiring SPR conference. Thank you very much and have a wonderful conference. I see, looking at the time, that I'm much too early, but I assume you probably have ways to use the additional time. So thank you very much and have a beautiful conference.